So first of all, welcome everyone. It's very hot, but you're hanging in there. It was hotter yesterday in terms of the auditorium where we were in the Institute. Just before beginning, I want to give a massive thank you to everyone at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose that has made this not only possible, but also quite seamless besides the heat, but hey, they couldn't speak to the gods. So maybe we can just give a round of applause. And there's many of them. I mean, Angelo from the comms team, but also Carolina Alves, our local kind of faculty coordinators. It's been fantastic. Okay, so what this session is going to do is try to push us outside of our comfort zones. I'm going to do a proper introduction to the panel in a minute, but I want to start with this. I think the last thing you want on a hot summer day is to hear people marketing what they do, right? So when I was talking to Kate, I don't know if we're allowed to swear, I always do anyway, but I was talking to Kate at the Royal Academy dinner, that was definitely name dropping, where she said, so what are we gonna do? I said, look, we're gonna talk about what we're trying to do, but especially all the things that potentially go wrong when we actually try to make shit happen. She's like, good, I'll be there, right? So that effort of actually trying to solve local problems, city-level problems, regional problems, national problems, and definitely the global stage, given the minister's role, and what goes wrong along the way. And especially given what we do at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose is always to link those problematic assumptions, the problematic theory within the problematic practice. There's a link between the two. But what we just heard in the previous session with Hilary Cottam. Hilary, are you still here? I know you have to leave at some early point. No? Okay, too bad, because Minister Chapman wanted to say how much you've inspired her. What we also just heard is we can't always talk about the barriers, right? We have to look at the solutions on the ground and what we learned, and we'll come to that in a minute. But it's also very important to be quite honest with what those problematic assumptions are, because in fact, the whole point, for example, for us to be an academic department is really to push that economic theory in new ways. Otherwise, you have all the fun stuff happening far away from the center, in the Department of Health, where people care about care, in the Department of the Environment, where they care about climate, but then we go back to the center, the Finance Ministry, the Treasury, the Chancellor, where we have some, often around the world, that old economic thinking, which then definitely lands on the ground in terms of problematic ways of thinking about budgeting, but also not putting enough attention, for example, on the issues we've been talking about throughout this conference on co-creation and co-production. So let me just actually first extend a huge thank you to both our panelists for taking part. And I might as well just introduce you now, because I will forget later because I'm so bad on logistics. Baroness Jennifer Chapman was appointed Minister of State for International Development, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Oh God, this is very long. In the Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office on February 2025. Before that, she was Parliamentary Undersecretary of State at the Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office, otherwise known as FCDO, between July 2024 and February 2025. And she was a Member of Parliament for Darlington from 2010 to 2019. And I think it was specifically about Darlington that you were talking about, also the books you've read of both Kate and Hilary Cottam, just thinking again about local communities and how we enact change. Kate, who's been part of different events. I remember all those fun photos we took of each other with Carlota Perez, for example, at the British Library in that first Rethinking the State forum we had back in 2018. She's been a friend of IPP for a while. Kate Raworth is an economist, I'd say definitely a rock star economist, focused on making economies fit for the 21st century, social and ecological realities. She's the author of the best-selling book, Doughnut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist, which has been published in over 20 languages, and she's also founder of the Doughnut Economics Action Lab. Okay, so that's the difficult part, because I always forget to say who people are. I also want to say that you've probably been wondering, what is that sign? Yeah, has anyone been wondering? Does anyone know? So when we went to COP, actually we go to COP, in fact we'll be talking about COP-related things in just a second. When we went to Glasgow, for COP, what number was that? 28, 29, I can't remember. We did what we did in the other COPs, including the last one, which is we hosted an all-woman panel. In that case, it was Nicola Sturgeon, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, myself, and Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados. And we asked Cornelia Parker, a woman artist here in the UK, to do a sign for us that would bring urgency to the conference. And so the proper sign that said, hurry up, it's time, was a neon sign that we actually hung up at the conference, and a lot of people, different prime ministers, presidents, ministers, were seen kind of doing little selfies around it. And then she made a smaller version for us that we could actually, kind of bring around more portably. Anyway, so this is the point, right? Hurry up, it's time. We can philosophize all we want, but actually the climate emergency, but also many other urgencies that we have, like health pandemics, where we found out that we just were completely not prepared. And we know from the science that there might be new viruses coming our way as the permafrost melts, and yet we haven't treated our social problems, our climate problems, with the same level of urgency that we tend to treat wars, where, as I said the other day, money tends to come out of thin air. Where was that money before? But also we don't actually put enough attention on how to design solutions that are really problem-oriented. You can't just throw money, right, at climate change. You can't just throw money at health. You can't just throw money in the city at knife crime. You actually need to formulate policies that are, for example, informed by the people on the ground, that are focused also on how all the different tools, whether it's procurement, whether it's the budgeting processes, but also literally the design of the partnerships. Think of all those innovation collaborations that we like to talk about, public-private innovation collaboration around the vaccine, for example. But how was it designed? Was it truly focused on the global problem that was about getting the vaccines accessible around the world? Or is it just an output, right? So the whole outcomes versus outputs. And that's indeed what we've been working on at the Institute. This whole notion of missions isn't just like a little fun word that we're throwing out there. It was just an example of what it means to design policies to really be about, to focus on the problems, market shaping, not market fixing. All the policies, whether it's global, whether it's local or national, are often framed in terms of fixing markets. So in terms of the global finance agenda, it's not surprising that we hear about things like financial gaps, right? There's about 4 to 7 trillion in a financial gap for the Sustainable Development Goals, those 17 goals that were set in 2015. And yet if we think about financial gaps, we don't think about the real problem, which is, well, what about the structure of finance, right? There's actually plenty of finance out there, but it's not structured to even enter the real economy, because a lot of it just remains in the financial sector, making millisecond trades, literally. And even when it gets into the real economy, it's not helping to steer our economies to actually be more inclusive, more sustainable, all these flashy words that we hear at big conferences like COP or the G20. And so what we wanted to do in this session is to actually focus on the experience of these leaders, intellectual leaders, political leaders, and a lot of us kind of go between those, right? Because when we're working with policymakers, we somehow also not so much become political, but it's not surprising that in our propaganda in the Institute, we say innovation is political, right? Because there's agency, you have to make decisions, and you kind of have to defend those decisions. And you'll know more than anyone else, when things go wrong, you need to also admit that, yeah, they went wrong, but we tried. But did you really try? Did you invest, for example, in the capacity to learn from failure, learning by doing, experimentation? So these kind of design principles, whether it's co-creation, co-production, experimentation, really listening with empathy, as Hilary Cotton was just talking about, to people who, for example, in her book on the welfare state, Radical Help, but also her new book on work, it's very much about participatory structures, true co-production, and not just surveys at the end, how did you feel? Or what do you think about climate change? And I'll talk a bit during the discussion about what like different experiments for us, but just really quickly, because I'm super interested in hearing from both the local and the global, that's sort of a false trade-off, right? Ideally, you would be learning at the local level and then be bringing those lessons to the global level. And when we've tried to do that, for example, right now we're really trying to help the G20 process through a role that I have as special advisor to the president of South Africa for the G20 process. It becomes very hard because in these conferences, whether it's COP or G20, it's extremely siloed. Like you think that governments are siloed, finance here, health there, environment there, even more so in these conferences. You'll literally have a Sherpa program, a working group, a task force here on finance, and a completely different one with literally different types of people because they've studied different things, they do different things, talking about industrial strategy. But what's the point of getting finance if it's not going to be for green industrializations, jobs, employment, reducing inequality? So bringing together the kind of what's to be done, right? For example, green industrial strategy, and how we're going to finance it, but also taking a lot of care along the way to work with people and not at them, is something that we've done in Barbados, where there's really, really interesting work there that we're doing, not only in the missions, but working with the Prime Minister on the social partnership, bringing labor, business, and government together and kind of going at each other to even define the missions. In Camden, same size, 300,000 people, 250 to 300. We worked a lot on, it's not enough to say missions and outcomes-oriented procurement. Who's informing that? So we worked with people, carers and carees receiving adult social care and housing estates to help inform Camden's mission-oriented procurement. So again, it's not being done at people, but with them. And in Mexico now, just with the new president, we're also working through the leadership of Marcela here, not only, again, with the civil service, but with local women economists who often don't have a voice. We know that economics is one of the most least female, if you want, disciplines, to bring local female voices to our own work, to actually contest, to wonder, are some of these words that we hear out there, like prosperidad compartida, shared prosperity, what's the history of that concept in that country? And how do we make sure these beautiful words like shared prosperity, missions, the common good, donut economics don't get captured and we don't end up washing, right? So that's really what I think would be super interesting to talk about. And I'm going to start with Kate through her work on donut economics. You've worked with so many different cities. Amsterdam, for some reason, is always put out there as the poster child that worked with you. If you want to just give us a sense of what you've tried to do, always going back to the kind of theory and practice, what you learned on the ground, and in the longer discussion we're going to have after your 5-minute opening, we're going to kind of go deeper into some of the challenges that you faced along the way. But since some people might not have read your book, even though they should, feel free to give kind of that more high-level opening on what it is that you've been doing.
Great, thank you. It's really wonderful to join you here. Hi. So I studied economics at university and was deeply frustrated by what I was taught. So in 2017, I wrote a book called Doughnut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. It drew on all the economics I hadn't been taught, especially ecological economics, feminist economics, complexity, commons theory, and I tried to put them together in one set of principles. I was trying to change the curriculum in universities. That was my goal. Did I succeed? No, I completely failed on that one. Economics departments, incredibly resilient and doors quite shut. What did happen, though, which really blew me away, was people just started getting in touch. I'm teaching this in the classroom. Here's to A-level teachers. I'm bringing this into my boardroom in my company. Can we be a donut company? We're using this in our community group. I'm bringing this into the health sector. I'm an architect. It's on my design board. I'm a town councillor. I'm a mayor. Can we do this here? Can we put this donut into practice here? And so it was really clear that practitioners wanted to put these ideas into practice. And I realized what I needed to do next as an advocate was to set up a small organization. It's called Doughnut Economics Action Lab. The clue is in the name. It's all about action. And it's a lab because this is one big experiment. How do you take ideas off the page and put them into practice? So we exist, we're a team of 15. We exist to work with practitioners, whether they are cities, councillors like local government, or businesses, or communities, or architects, or health professionals, or teachers who want to put these ideas into practice in their field. And I'm just going to share what's happening around local government. So first, it was working with the C40. They got quite interested in the ideas because the donut, if you think of a donut, the kind of a hole with a hole in the middle, it's the goal. And the goal is to leave nobody in the hole falling short on the essentials of life, leave nobody without the essential resources every person needs, but don't overshoot the planetary boundaries. And the reason I put this at the heart of the theory is because I was really fed up with the goal being growth, 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 which phenomenally is back at the heart of UK politics. Grow, grow, grow. I can't believe it. I said, no, let's start with what we actually are here for. Meet the needs of all people, live within the means of the planet. This is the goal. Then what kind of economic mindset would equip today's students and indeed today's policymakers with even half a chance of getting there? That's what Doughnut Economics sets out to do. And so towns and cities saw this donut and asked, can we aim here to meet the needs of all of our people within the means of the living planet? Amsterdam came first, and so we downscaled the donut. We made it a tool. We realized we needed to turn this into a practical tool. And it was really important in making that tool that it asks both, how can the people of this place thrive? local people? How can we ensure everybody here has their essentials? How can the local ecology of this place thrive? How can we create a generous city that sequesters carbon, stores groundwater, cools the air on a hot day, rather than releases carbon, floods on a hot day, and creates a heat island effect? So local conditions, but also recognizing that every town and city worldwide is connected to the whole world. And therefore is, think of this room, right? We're wearing clothes that have been stitched by people around the world. The resources, the cotton, the materials, the screens, our phones. So much of this has been imported into the UK, the materials and the labor to make life good here. So we have to be responsible for the impact that our good lives here are having on people worldwide. So this tool was very much about looking at good life here, but also how are we impacting on others? Are we coming back within planetary boundaries? Are we respecting people through global supply chains around this procurement, through global trade agreements, all the ways that we can impact people? Is this a sanctuary city? How do we welcome migrants with a culture and with a policy? All the ways that we impact people worldwide. So this was the tool. Amsterdam wanted to go first, and they're one of the kind of city that likes to do people first, right? We want to publish this first. We worked with them. It's the only one we actually did as a team together with the city, like, let's pioneer the first one. And they published it in April 2019. This was the month in which the city of Amsterdam had its highest COVID infection rate. And I was really struck that they still went ahead and did this. It was at the heart of their circular city. They want to be 100% circular by 2050. This is a kind of classic mission, right? 100% circular. We don't know what that means, but we're going to go for it. And so the donut was the framing concept at the heart of that. When Amsterdam published that, there was a small article in The Guardian that went viral on the internet. And that really got it known. And so it was very clear that the role of the media in making this visible, and people just picked it up. 6 weeks later, the city of Copenhagen, another cool Euro city that kind of wants to keep up with Amsterdam, votes with a massive majority in the council. We're going to explore what it means to do the donut here. And that, for me, was the first sign of the power of peer-to-peer inspiration in making these things take off. It's the strongest reason why things get adopted. Then there was Barcelona. Then there was Brussels. So we had Amsterdam, Copenhagen, Barcelona, Brussels. I thought, is this going to really be alphabetical? This is going to take a hell of a time. But actually, then it diversified. So now, 5 years on, 6 years on, there are over 100 towns, cities, districts, counties around the world that are using and trying out the tools. And 50 of those have publicly embedded the concept of donut economics at the heart of their vision, their strategy, their processes. Many of them have created their own downscale donut portrait of the city. So gathering local data, to what extent are people here falling short? To what extent are we overshooting planetary boundaries?
That's the bit we're going to do in a second.
Yes.
On where we're falling short and your actual
no, that's just the tool. That's the tool. That's the tool.
Okay.
You want me to stop?
Yeah, just time's up because we said...
There we are. There's the intro.
Sorry. Luckily, I mean, yeah. Fantastic. And it was actually also a pleasure working together during COVID in the Commission on the Economics of Health for All, where we had all these, again, different women bringing these particular tools, right? Jayati Ghosh with her work on seeing development from a very different lens. Marilyn Waring in New Zealand bringing an indigenous lens. So again, it's always about the lens. It's not just like a list of important things we have to do that then becomes not only a shopping list, but becomes a list where people can choose what to do and what not to do. So it's precisely as we were talking about in the previous session, by having a dashboard, by having principles, whether it's common good principles, human rights principles, donut principles, that we can actually hold the system accountable. And I'm going to come back to some of the issues that you face on the ground. Minister Chapman, I think we said that we would call each other by our first name. So Jenny, thank you. If you've started this job recently in a moment in history where multilateralism, and given your job to work with the global community, you need multilateralism, is at a very kind of dangerous point. There's lots of people saying we no longer need it, but others, for example, 3 presidents who we actually work with, President Sanchez in Spain, President Lula in Brazil, and welcome to some of our Brazilian colleagues here, and President Ramaphosa in South Africa recently actually wrote a letter. This is the moment more than ever that we need multilateralism. And at the same time, we have Prime Minister of Barbados, who again, we've worked with now for 3 years, who led something called the Bridgetown Initiative, who said, look, it's not just about getting finance to the Global South, but changing the structures, so the voices of the Global South countries, which have not been there in the design of the Bretton Woods institutions, needs to be there. It's not just about financing good stuff, it's changing, again, the structure of that financing and recognizing that voice matters. So really, I just want to open up to you where you see the challenges are, and I don't want to go into the specific challenges of international development right now, but really just in terms of also just coming to this job right now in a moment in history where people actually know more than they should about the global problems, also because there's a geopolitical crisis. If you want to just talk about how you're approaching it in terms of your vision, coming back to the notion that we're not just, women out there doing stuff, we're bringing a lens. So what is the lens you're trying to bring to this job?
I mean, that's a really good question. And when I first accepted your invitation, I thought, right, I am not an academic, I'm not a climate scientist, I've never written a book. I thought, what do I have to offer to this conversation? But actually, my entire political life, which started in my hometown of Darlington in the northeast of England, where I was a community volunteer, I used to work on music projects with young people, volunteer with the youth service, did little garden competitions in my local community, and then became a local councillor. My approach then was heavily influenced by Hilary Cottam, who I happened to meet when she was running the Design Council, and her strong message at that point, and I'd kind of lost track of her since, but it seems that she's still banging the same drum, and I'm glad.
Sitting on that chair.
Honoured. About participation, about involvement in decision making, about empowerment, all the things that we don't do very well in the development world. So when I was a councillor, I used to make sure that whenever we did our budget consultation, we would take our decision making out into every community. There was a little bit more money in local government back then, by the way. I'm talking about sort of the early 2000s. And we would have face painters, we'd make sure we got women with their kids into the room, we'd ask them what they thought about changes to crossing patrols, what they thought about changes to adult social care. We had Sure Start at the time, help us design the building properly so there's somewhere to put your buggy before you go in, that kind of thing. And that, to me, instinctively, that is the right way to do politics.
Yeah.
And that's really obvious when you're talking about your role as a ward councillor. And there were lots of opportunities to do that, and I miss it like hell because it's so easy to have a community meeting, solve a problem, make a plan, hold the police to account, that sort of thing. Later, I was a Member of Parliament, as Mariana said, representing Darlington, and you come down to Westminster, and we were newly into opposition, and I think, was it Nye Bevan who said, I thought that the power would be on the local council, then I thought the power would be in Parliament, so I went to Parliament, then I thought the power was in the Cabinet, so I went to Cabinet, then I realised the power was really in the community. And that's what I've just learned. Appointed to the Cabinet 2 months ago, actually the power is in local communities. And that goes for communities anywhere in the world. What I found now that I'm responsible for international development with an awful lot less money to spend, and when you said, where does the money for defence suddenly appear from? It's come from my budget. But actually, yes, there's going to be less money for aid and less money to spend on some of the development work as we've done it previously. And I'm not happy about that. I think that that's a decision we regret, and we should get back to spending 0.7% of our wealth on development as soon as we can. But that it does present us with an opportunity to completely reconsider the way that we work. And we have African leaders who've been telling us for a long time now that they want to move beyond aid, they want to work in partnership, they want to co-design what happens, they want to grow their tax base so that they can support their own public services, educate their own children, design their own health services, have their own policies and their own systems that are strong and resilient. They've been saying that, I mean, even though I haven't been in this role very long, I'd heard that. I'd heard that said, I recognise it. And it's a very similar conversation to the one that you can have with a group of women in Darlington who want to set up their own playgroup or whatever it might be. People want control, and they want choice, and they want the ability, they want the power to make those choices and to act on them themselves. So we're entering a very different phase in the way that we think about development. These ideas are not new, but the drive, the lens, if you like, that is changing. And that's a challenge for us as a government department, where we have had a lot of money to spend, actually, over the years. And we've got quite good ways of assessing impact. We've got good ways of reporting value for money, because we've had to, because that's right. And I would say that our international development spend is one of the most well-audited, traceable, visible spending lines across government. We've got to make sure we spend it now in a completely different way. So what Marianne says about multilateralism and what Lula is saying and Prime Minister Motley is saying is completely right. Multilateralism has never mattered more than it does today, but it's got to change. We've been a big donor multilaterally. We've been sitting on these boards of these big, like the World Bank and all of this. And I'm now, believe it or not, a governor at the World Bank, which my husband finds absolutely extraordinary. But I sat there at the meeting just a few weeks ago, and I'm looking around at the sort of finance ministers and development ministers from across the world, and suddenly it's the time to hear Canada to speak. And great, Canada, great, wonderful people, close friends, Mark Carney, fantastic. But the representative from Canada takes the mic and speaks for Canada, and then speaks for the whole of the Caribbean, because that's his role, is to speak on behalf of the entire Caribbean. Now, this probably did make sense whenever this was decided. It makes very little sense now. So I think there is a real problem in the multilateral space around voice and around who has the mic, who is speaking on behalf of who, how shared that is, because that fundamentally decides whose priorities come first. So I think we've got a real challenge now, particularly as some countries are taking something of a step back. That means those of us that are still present and who want to lead have got a responsibility to lead, but there's more of a space and opportunity to do that. So what I don't think, though, is going to work very well for us is if the UK tries to do this kind of heroic, we have the blueprint, we know the answers, do what we say kind of approach. And what we need to do is work in this collaborative, Hillary Cottam-friendly, participatory way where we co-design how things need to look with our friends, partners and allies across the world. And I think that's, if you're in politics, and we're all in politics in different ways, because it's about relationships, making decisions and getting things done. But if you're in politics, the one thing that you want above all else to do is to make change and to make decisions. You don't just want to keep things the same. You don't just want to make, let's cut the budget. Let's, take little bits off these sort of programs over here and hope that it doesn't hurt too much. We have to fundamentally change the way that we think and the way that we do development. That's a huge opportunity. I'm really glad to have this job at this moment in time, because I think there are so many things now that are up for grabs, so many arguments to be had, cases to be made, places in the world that are so fragile. I just come back from Chad, where they are supporting people who are escaping the biggest humanitarian crisis on the planet right now in Sudan, and they're doing a very good job of it. They're weak. The government structures are weak. The way that people have been so generous and able to support their brothers and sisters from across the border is phenomenal. But we need to support those countries. And the way that we do that is by strengthening their governments and helping them to make decisions for themselves in the future. Because their solutions to many people seeking asylum in their country will be very, very different to the solutions that are sought in Europe for lots of interesting historical reasons. But I think this is an exciting time. I take the lessons that I learned as a local councillor and the people that inspired me, many of whom I lived alongside in Darlington, and others whose thinking has inspired me, like Hillary. And we have to apply those things on a global scale now. And I think I no longer feel intimidated. I feel like I'm in the right space, and that I'm going to leave this session with lots of new ideas and hopefully some inspiration.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Oops. Thank you also for reminding us just the tragedy, actually, also of the financing. As you say, we need to change how we think about aid, but the level of reduction globally on development aid is, one could call it a crime in terms of the number of people also who are dying because of that. Right away, literally, it didn't take long for that to happen. And that's, you talk about collaborating globally, but there's no better way to do that on a specific problem. So for example, in South Africa, they set up this mRNA hub. Again, getting prepared for the next pandemic, because unfortunately there will be some where it's actually a collaboration between South Africa, Rwanda, Barbados, and some other countries that are really trying to say, let's actually test out, if you want, in our words, sandbox, what it means to actually collaborate with principles. For example, knowledge sharing, because we know that how the vaccine was produced, actually many of the companies like Pfizer didn't join the patent pool. But instead of, we can talk about these questions, again, at the local, at the national, at the global, but having global collaborations that are not just high and mighty talking about multilateralism, but actually trying to do things together. And we just published a water report, the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, and there's no better area than water to actually talk about global collaboration, because the problem is global. It cannot be solved without global cooperation. It's not just because we believe in global cooperation, but literally deforestation of the Amazon, for example, has been proven by the climate scientists, of which one, Johan Rockström, was on the commission, to actually be causing floods and droughts in other parts of the world. So we can talk about poverty, we can say 1,000 kids die every single day under the age of 5 of polluted water, and that's true. We can put up a lot of statistics that depress us, and they should depress us, and we should have the urgency, because no one should die due to polluted water. But it's another thing to then actually pay attention to the principles of collaboration. And again, with Kate, with that Global Commission, we said if health for all is the goal, backtrack and design the economic system to deliver on it in terms of finance, in terms of innovation collaborations, budgeting, even how we value and what we value. So on that, I want to pass back to Kate, just in terms of that kind of on-the-ground experience that you've had. Feel free to choose one or two. We know, again, the ambition, the vision, why it's so important, but coming back to what we said we talk about when you're getting massage, you're like, yeah, press more there, it hurts. Where the pain points currently are, where they have been, and maybe some successes of removing and, lightening up those knots. But be, as frank as you can with us on where things go wrong.
Okay, so the way that we work is that we work with places that come to us. We've never tried to advocate or lobby or convince anyone to use it. So it's self-selection, which is fantastic. And there's no money changing hands. We're not consultants to them. We're funded by foundations. So everything we put is in the commons. So they're picking up our tools and we act like advisors. But they bring together their own team, whether it's inside the council or they work with a local university, to do their own analysis and choose how they want to take this forward. So the way that donut economics is being put into practice in towns and cities is different in every single place. And the first thing we did, actually, my brilliant colleague, Leonora Grucheva, she did an analysis of how are they doing it? Let's learn from them. How are all the different ways they're getting started? Wrote that into a report. And again, that had massive ripple effects of encouraging other places to learn from each other. So you want some pain points. If you're a local government and you have, it very often starts with somebody, a councillor, a mayor, who's just got this determination to do things differently. And they see the frame of donut economics and it just chimes with a vision they already have. So I think it acts like a sail on their ship. It gives them a frame, it gives them a name, there's other people doing this, and they choose to start adopting it. But of course, they're a local government. So they only have a certain amount of budget. They often don't have any revenue-raising powers, or only local ones through, parking fees or through local rates. They don't have control over all the legislation that actually controls how the economy is. So if they're trying to make their economy regenerative and a circular economy, make it distributive by design. They are a small unit within a nation, within a region, within the world, within the global financial system. So of course you are hampered because the entire system around you is pushing in the opposite direction. It's holding you still. And as you said, innovation, like if you dare to innovate, the onus is on you to show that it works. The onus is rarely on those who, with the old growth-based economy, the onus doesn't seem to be on them to prove why we should still pursue this. The onus is on you to dare to say you're going to try something different. So it's a bold place that does this in the first place. But you're caught inside a much wider system of national and international regulation that is hampering what you're trying to do. So you won't be able to get there. And actually, it's partly why I admire local politicians who do this, because they start anyway. There's no place that can say, we are now living in the donut. We're meeting the needs of all our people within the means of the living planet. A single place can't get there, because we'll only get there if we all get there, because we're connected to the whole world. And yet people start. And they have to convince, they have to convince their own colleagues. They have to convince other colleagues in other parties in the coalition. They have to take it to the public. So actually I have an admiration for people who get elected and need to get re-elected. It's much easier than being an academic or an advocate, and you can just stand for these bold ideas. These are folks who actually have to take it to the public. But you're trying to bring about a vision where you don't have all the financial or regulatory tools in hand. You're hampered and part of a much wider system. So that's one really obvious way that you want to bring about vision, but it's going to get stuck.
Thank you. And it's interesting you mentioned the funding model. So we also just work with mainly foundations that pay for the work and work with those who come to us.
Right.
That's why it's useful to write books, because sometimes it just literally happens like, oh, great book, come help us. And then you're like, yeah, but a book is just a book. Let's go down into the basement, work actually on the concrete problems, bring back, for example, again, I mentioned procurement. We worked on public banks, outcomes-oriented budgeting, this whole notion of mission-oriented industrial strategy, but it's really hard. And then you bring back the lesson at that top door that, opened it up and say, well, we learned a lot of difficulties that might have to change along the way. For example, you can talk as much as you want about outcomes-oriented procurement for school meals that are healthy, tasty, and sustainable, that Camden is doing, Brazil is doing that, Sweden is doing that. But then if the procurement law doesn't allow that, or in the case of Italy, where I'm from, where the experience around corruption, which was often around procurement, then procurement gets straitjacketed in an agency for anti-corruption. L'Agenzia Nazionale dell'Anticorruzione sounds wonderful because it's Italian, but it actually is terrible for doing anything ambitious with procurement, which doesn't mean you shouldn't battle corruption. But that, for example, is a huge bottleneck. And it's interesting that only, again, during war or during the pandemic, we end up doing advanced purchasing agreements, outcomes-oriented procurement. But in normal times, we just go back to having these very static tools. So can we come back again to this issue of moving away from aid towards what we're actually talking about here in this session, building capacity? And we put a green transition. I kind of regret that, because we're talking about much more than that. We're talking about any sort of goals, inclusive growth, green growth. But where green growth is not just about energy, but it's just as much about what we wear, how we move, sustainable mobility. That's what we mean by a mission-oriented industrial strategy. Put the goals and think of that cross-sectoral, economy-wide change that has to happen for that goal to be accomplished, but especially for government to think out of its silos. Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, working together, which again, surprise, surprise, they do during COVID, the so-called war room. COVID ends, we go back to the silos. So just in terms of those silos and your experience in this ministry, and you said that you were at the World Bank and you're on the governing board, then you also deal with ministers of finance. And maybe we can just pause on that relationship. You don't have to hang out any dirty laundry in terms of the current Minister of Finance here, but more the global, right? That global discussion between what you care about, which is development, and you just came back from Chad, and then the financing, not only being cut by ODA, but some, if you want, ideology within the Ministries of Finance or the World Bank. Anything you want to say on that kind of need to change how these ministries work together?
They do need to change. I mean, just reflecting on what Kate said about local government, I mean, one of the reasons people do it anyway is because they're living it, and they're accountable to their next door neighbour or the person across the street. But the other thing is, and if anyone's thinking about going into politics, definitely consider local government, is you've got so much freedom and agency, and you only have to talk to about 3 people to try something out. You try doing something different in government when you've got a whole department around you, and then someone says, oh, but we need to do a write around. which will take months. And then you've got to get Treasury to agree with what you want to do. Oh, and then at the end, someone says, oh, and it hasn't been signed off by number 10, by which point you've forgotten what it was and why you decided this was a good idea in the first place, and your soul is dying. But the good thing about being a new government is we actually still quite like each other, and we get on, and we haven't fallen out and started slagging each other off in the press just yet. It will happen. But no. So I've got, and I'm not the, we do get on genuinely as a group of people, and we have, somewhat inspired by Mariana, and she can mark our homework, I'm sure she will, a sense that we want to try and think in this mission-driven way. It's really hard to do in practice, but there are some instances of where we're just about getting some sort of movement in the right direction. And my example is the recent spending review round, where historically the ODA budget would have been handled by the Treasury. The Treasury, there are about 6 or 7 different government departments that spend this money. So it's the Foreign Office, Department of Health, DCIT, DEFRA, DESNES. So they all spend ODA in different, in different degrees. And the Treasury would settle with them and say, this is how much you're going to get, this is how much you're going to get. Zero oversight of one another's budget, loads of duplication, no single strategy across Whitehall. This year, and this is, I hope you, it probably sounds really straightforward and sensible. This is revolution in front of our eyes. The Treasury said to the Foreign Office, to me, what we want you to do is you negotiate with each of these departments. You decide who's going to get how much. You decide what they're going to do with it, and you agree with them how that's going to be run. So you're working with oversight to single strategy. So nature programs or energy programs that we're spending development assistance on, those should be coordinated properly, and there should be a single strategy, and you should meet regularly, and you should understand what each other's doing. So that means they have to be open to our scrutiny, and actually I have to be open to theirs, because that's only fair, and we have to be collegiate. And it's been really successful. It's been quite painful. There were, when there's less money, everyone starts the conversation defending their bit of the forest, but you soon get on past that and actually work out that there's opportunities there too. So we are changing the way that we work across Whitehall. It sounds really simple. I hope you realise that this has been a not straightforward thing.
Yeah.
And civil servants are looking at us like, you lot are different, aren't you? But I think this bodes well, and I think we need to keep this going, and it mustn't just happen at times of budget choice. It has to be at times of priority setting and deciding what we're going to get excited about, where we're going to put our time. We've got London Climate Action Week next week. We're working together on that. So we're trying to keep it going in a sort of make it ordinary, just make this the way we work.
Fantastic. So one of the ways we have been marking the homework, and actually through long workshops, submissions, pre-election and post-election, has actually been to say, let's be careful. If we're going to use the word mission, or at least even cite our work along the way, then we have to come back and say, well, actually, maybe you didn't read it, because growth is not the mission, right? So the fact that the #1 mission was growth, we thought that's actually a problem. It's not a pedantic issue. It's just literally the problem. That's the economic outcome, but there's no country that I know that has ever achieved growth by talking about growth. The whole point about missions is whether it's a mission around water, health, biodiversity, or city-level mission, is that if you do it in the way that can really inspire, catalyze, but also have the right conditionalities at the contract level to have true public and private investment, especially net investment in the private sector, in a country, by the way, where the private sector makes profits but doesn't always invest, right? There's a high profits, low investment economy. We're 28th in the OECD in terms of business investment in the UK. So to really catalyze business investment and not allow the kind of Thames Water dynamic where the profits that are made are given back to the shareholders instead of the infrastructure, that actually requires a different partnership, again, problem-oriented with true partnership, symbiotic and not parasitic, blah, 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 blah. But the point is, if you get that right, lo and behold, growth happens.
And I think what I would say, I totally take that, and I would ask you to mark our substance and not our rhetoric.
Yeah.
So Pat McFadden said, week 2 of government, do you know, there's no growth tap in the Cabinet Office that I've been able to find to get the growth.
You're absolutely right. And again, we're there actually to help. So we're like with the, people who are doing the missions, but then it does matter. And it's not that they're not doing it. It's just where we can, if you want to be useful, where we're interacting right now is literally on the design of, what does it mean to not be business friendly, but to get the right relationship with business around certain types of areas and to learn from others. Like the CHIPS Act, for example, in the US was something we helped inform, where that money that went to the semiconductors wasn't just a giveaway. It was, again, conditional that those companies reinvest their profits, so not use share buybacks, improve working conditions and worker pay, and use energy efficient supply chains. And the point is not to say good versus bad, is what can we learn on the ground from where this was tried. For example, if you put too many conditions, it becomes what some have called the everything bagel. Right? So again, that kind of design challenge, which you can only learn from looking on the ground. But just one more question to you before I go to Kate and then the audience. You talked about, how difficult it is, and it's absolutely true. There's both global financial pressures, and we see that with the bond markets, but sometimes those problems are kind of self-imposed, right? So the fiscal rules, which the chancellor here rightfully started to relax in order to actually have the public investment we need. Many have argued that for a long time in the environment circles and feminist circles. So the cost of inaction is greater than the cost of action. So you have to know how to value public investment. And if we don't do that in terms of its, again, economy-wide spillovers, that's why we end up having these kind of strict fiscal rules. And it's a global issue, right? So this is a global discussion. Can you maybe just reflect on any of these conversations you've had, for example, around the World Bank and what you heard, like what the equivalent of that has been in your discussions at the global level, right? So national fiscal rules should be smart and not constraining. How have you so far? I mean, again, it's quite a recent position, if you want to just say anything.
I mean, there is a thing about sort of your first meeting at the World Bank being brand new, rocking up and saying, well, I tell you what you're doing wrong. That's not, we also have to do diplomacy. But I think there is certainly things that I can see already that I am talking to people about there, which are this one point around voice, but also I think I don't want to call it a failure, because it's not a failure, but a reluctance to invest in some of the more fragile places in the world. So if we are moving away from a sort of aid donor model towards an investment model, which I think we are, and that seems to be what is welcomed by our partner countries, then we have to be prepared to think about the way our tolerance for risk around that, how we encourage our pension funds, the IDA fund at the World Bank, BII, that is our sort of investment vehicle here, into those those more difficult, traditionally sort of less investable parts of the world. I think that's possible. There is an openness to have that conversation with the UK now, not least because others are backing away from some of these investments, and we're not. We're leaning in. So I think that's just one example where already we can see that there's a change. It's something that's, it's not simple and straightforward, but it's something that we ought to be pushing for. And I think we don't push for it on our own. We push for it alongside other nations who are saying this is what they want to.
Right, fantastic. Kate, can we stay on this topic of finance? And then after this question, I'd love to open up, and maybe we can take 3 questions at a time, so start thinking about those. Just on the finance question, there is, varieties of capitalism out there. There's also varieties of funding, and cities have different ways in which they actually receive funding, and some are starved of financing, some are less so. Can you just talk a bit about the constraints that you've seen on the ground, where as great as the local conditions and participatory structures that both you and Hilary Cottam talk about a lot, sometimes there's certain constraints that actually are different between Amsterdam, say, and a city in the UK. We have many councils in the UK going bankrupt, and that's also due to how they are financed and different types of constraints. Just that variety of the, in complexity theory, they look at the feedback between those mechanisms that create differences and structural constraints and the feedback between them, the kind of structural constraints in particular cities and how they were perhaps different in some other cities. And do you bring some of that learning? Do you also talk about finance, where it comes from, and fiscal rules and so on? Or does that stay kind of outside of the donut?
Yeah, so we're working with cities in very different countries in different parts of the world. And so they have very different devolved powers to raise money. So one city we were working with, I think it was in Seattle, they were saying, no, sorry, it was Portland, they were saying we want to get rid of cars in the city centre, but actually car parking is one of the main ways we raise public funding.
Yeah.
So we're totally caught in, we'll lose our funding at the same time that we get rid of the cars. So really caught there, whereas a very different situation, the city of Grenoble in France, I would say, and everyone knows of Amsterdam, oh, donut economics, oh, it's happening in Amsterdam because of this little article that was in The Guardian in 2019. But actually, there are other cities that have taken it, built on what Amsterdam did and gone further. And I would say Grenoble in France has done amazing things. The deputy mayor there said, I am eco-Marxist. It makes sense, right? He was ecological, he was social, this makes sense. And they're just going for it. And they've done beautiful work of putting donut economics into practice in the city. There, they have the power to raise a wealth tax. And the mayor said to me when I was there last year, he said, yeah, we've raised a wealth tax. We think we're too unequal here. We are imposing a wealth tax in our region because we believe we should be a more equitable society. Now, many local governments might say, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to scare away the wealthy people. Actually, it's a fantastic place to live. People are drawn there. So huge difference between I'm afraid I'm going to lose the parking fees versus I can raise a wealth tax. Massive difference in the scope of what countries can do and the extent to which they can align the way they raise their fiscal revenue with becoming more regenerative, becoming more distributive, or are they stuck bringing cars in the city? So yes, massive changes.
Fascinating. It was interesting in Europe where when the pressures were all to reduce deficits, especially in the so-called PIGS, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, we saw debt to GDP actually rise, right? So they were cutting, but debt to GDP rose precisely because they weren't actually investing in all those things that drive the denominator, long-run growth, let alone good growth, which is what we care about. But that idea also of moving away when we're looking at finance from kind of problematic, I would call it, economically illiterate understandings of debt to GDP, those kind of, voodoo numbers. If you go above a certain amount, all hell's going to break loose. And where you have experiences where actually, because of the inspiration, whether it's around donut economics, mission orientation, so on and so forth, a catalytic effect happened, which actually expanded the budget, right? Because governments are not households. There's lots of people who've written about this, but what does it mean to then expand productive capacity, which then creates that Keynesian multiplier, which is in there in the theory, but the multiplier doesn't just happen. It depends actually on catalytic things happening around the economy. So I think ultimately what we're also talking about is inspiring, unless there's even goals to achieve, whether it's around housing, whether it's around sewage and so on. There is no reason actually to invest, and you don't even need money. And you could just do a market fixing framing. Anyway, so why don't we open up to the floor? I'm going to go kind of left, center, and right for the first three. I'll start in the center there with, you, sorry. And maybe, again, please be brief, because there's lots of you. We have 30 minutes. Say just who you are, and then as quick as you can, the question that ends with the question mark.
Hi, my name is Charit Gunodhan. I'm from the Institute of Political Economy. It's looking at the sovereign debt crisis in Sri Lanka mainly. It's really a question to the Minister about some of the reforms that are needed from a global monetary point of view. The UK government and even the European Union are not really enabling the reforms to happen. So when we talk about development, the question was really, for example, in the UN Finance for Development Conference in Seville, they have completely blocked all the reforms that are needed. So we're just trying to find out how can we support those type of changes to make it happen. And just as another point is that I was also a local councillor in London. And the frustrations which Kate was mentioning was very genuine. And the issue is that without a right level of addressing the macroeconomic issues and the fiscal policies, and when we make up rules like fiscal rules and stuff, it really constrains making real changes at local levels.
Great, thank you so much. I said I'd go to the other, so yeah. Or is there, is there a woman on that side? No? Okay, so you, fine. I can't see.
Yes, my name is Arif Azad. I work in urban health, and also I am, health right activist in Pakistan. My question is to Kate and also to Professor, in Mariana. How can, a city government and economic growth can ensure that access to healthcare and, health equalities are ensured? What is the role of, local government in increasing access to healthcare and also reducing health inequalities?
Great, thank you. This side? Yep, here in the front row. Front table.
Thank you. My name is Halldóra. I'm a member of I work with the Icelandic Association for Humane Technology. I just wanted to say that this is inspiring, and Kate, especially, I've been in Parliament for the last 8 years, and I'm not, I lack this, I don't have this formal education, and my experience there was the whole focus is on if you don't know how to talk about economics, then you're really not listened to. It's just like, you're not an economist, you're not a lawyer, like, what do you have to say about anything? So your book, The Doughnut Economy, it really made this accessible to me as a politician, and gave me kind of, this feeling like, I'm allowed to have something to say about this issue. Like, I can talk about this stuff, even though, I'm not an expert or don't have the degrees. So thank you for that. My question to you would be, now trying to build up this association, where really we're talking about building capacity and how we can affect change. And I hear a lot from a lot of associations and people that I've talked to here over the past 2 days, everyone's kind of thinking about the same thing, like, how do we fund this? Like, how do we make this happen? Because at least in Iceland, I imagine it's like this elsewhere, when the government is making decisions, they talk to, like, the biggest lobbyists are like the Association of Icelandic Business, the Association of Icelandic Industry. These guys get to sit down with the decision makers on everything. And so all of these little associations who are trying to build a more humane future, we don't have that money, we don't have that backing behind us to be able to, like, lobby or press in that direction. So really my question to you is, what would your advice be to us who are really trying to affect change? Like, how do we fund ourselves to be able to continue this work and really affect change? Like, how do we work better together also? That's been the main question of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Why don't we start with those three, and then I'll take another three. Should we start with Jenny? The first one, from the Institute for Political Economy, what are the reforms that are actually required that potentially, I think you were implying that the UK and the EU are holding back?
Are you talking about the whole the discussion around debt that we've just been having? Yeah.
And also the reforms in the IMF and the World Bank.
Yeah, so just to take the debt one, there is a big conference coming up in Seville at the end of next week, where we're going to be discussing finance for development. Yep. And there's been an argument going on about the way that developing countries who are finding themselves in a situation where they're spending more on their debt repayments than they are on health. This is not a sustainable situation. They cannot possibly be expected to be able to run their economies, to support their population, to make good decisions when they're in that situation. So we need to do something about it. At the moment, the process, it's called a common framework. It's a bit like, I would call, like a debt restructuring process. It takes too long. Then there is no guarantee that they won't have to make payments as they negotiate. The private sector, which, by the way, holds the majority of the debt in most of these places now. This is not a Jubilee situation where the UK gets to write off loads of debt. This is private sector debt. And there's no guarantee that those people will take part. So there is a problem, and there are only 5 countries that have gone through this process in 5 years. So this is not working well enough. We need to change it. What the prescription is to change it is where the discussion lies. There is a desire to have a whole new process devised through the UN, which the UK is not against, and we have not opposed that at all. We've supported the text that's just been agreed. We are worried about that, though, because everyone tells me, in my experiences, that it is a problem that needs to be solved tomorrow. Setting up a whole new UN process to fix it isn't probably the right, it's not going to get you where you want to be quickly enough. So my option that I'm putting forward is that we try and fix the common framework process. So we deal with the political, and the politics is always underpriced when these things are devised by people who are not politicians. If you say to leaders of an African country who are elected for 4 or 5 years, embark on this process, which is going to be really unpopular in your country. It's going to involve some pain and some, it's going to be quite a difficult thing. And you have to go re-election midway through that process. That doesn't work for them. So the whole thing's got to be quicker. They've got to be able to sell it to their population. There's got to be a real win for them that's quicker, because the politics is real. And I think we can do that. And I think we ought to be able to do that more quickly than a process through the UN. But because we believe in partnership, and so many countries are saying we want to try a process through the UN, we're not going to block that. Of course we're not. We're going to hope that that works and it throws up something that's really effective. Both things can be done at the same time.
We actually have 2 sessions at this Seville conference and Financing for Development in the official program. There's 5 official panels, 2 of which we're participating in. And one of the messages we're bringing is absolutely we have to fix that absurd, one could argue, barbaric situation where many countries are spending more on on their debt repayments and health and education. But that's not enough. Yeah. What we also need is to literally redesign some of these institutions. For example, some of the multilateral development banks are more worried about their credit rating. By the way, the credit ratings agencies that should have, many of them, been closed down, given how we learned that they operated during the financial crisis, but they still have this hold on the banks. But the banks themselves, where they've recently been getting some of the financing from, has itself been almost making them more wed to commercial targets. So this whole notion of bringing public purpose, global missions to the center of the MDBs that have 2.2 trillion, and changing their relationship with the NDBs, the national development banks, like BNDES in Brazil. We have someone here who used to run it. And then those banks having a different relationship with the private sector. So not just giving out money to whatever sector is yelling for help, but again, conditional and actually moving in a direction and helping them move in that direction needs as much attention, right? So it's not just the financing quantity, it's the quality of that finance. And a lot of these blended finance deals have been very problematically structured. So we'll put out some of the resources after this conference for each of the sessions. Kate, there's 2 questions that you can choose to answer, answer them both. One from Iceland, in terms of the power that's required on the ground when you have the kind of economic boogeyman silencing those local actors. And I think the question was also inspired by how you opened up saying, we actually have to change how alienated people also feel from the theory. We need to action it and make people part of that. But also the question around health, from the question from our friend from Pakistan.
I think you should answer the question around health.
Okay.
Do you want to go now?
No, you go first.
Okay, so I'm really delighted that Doughnut Economics resonated with you. Thank you. Because in the words of Harjun Chan, economics is far too important to leave it to the economists, right? We all need to have a voice in it. And when people say to me, oh, I always thought there was something wrong with me, I didn't get economics, and then I read Doughnut Economics, and now I realize there's something wrong with economics. That's the win. So I'm really delighted. I'm going to tell a little story about Milton Friedman. So Milton Friedman, the bad boy of neoliberalism, right? In the 1940s, he and Friedrich Hayek and others, in 1947, they went to this little Swiss village, Montpellier, and they said, we want to create a new paradigm. It's called neoliberalism. They were like pushing back against Keynesianism, right? 1947, we're going to change the economic paradigm. Well, they did it in the end, but it took them 33 years, right? 1980, I'd say, Reagan, Thatcher on the stage, bang, it is the paradigm the world's run by. So it took a hell of a long time. But they had behind them huge money because there was huge corporate interest. So they seeded think tanks, right, that still exist today that were telling these ideas. They seed professorships in university to make these ideas look very academic. So we don't have that behind us. We don't have that money. But I listened to a quote from Milton Friedman. This is what he said. He said, only a crisis, whether it's real or perceived, brings about real change. And when that crisis occurs, people turn to the ideas that are lying around. And then he went on, he said, that I believe is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. So I don't agree with Milton on his economics, but I really like that quote, and I'm like, thank you, Milton, we'll take that. And he said, so only a crisis, well, we know there are crises happening, we know there are crises coming. Places are hit by crisis. What will political leaders do when the next crisis comes? To what ideas will they turn? Friedman says, have your ideas lying around. For us, the strategy is, I don't just want these ideas lying around, let's have them up and running. So that's why we're working with 50 places. You could say, that's amazing, 50 places. Or you could say, that's tiny, just 50. But you know what? There's 50 local governments around the world that are calmly getting on with putting a different paradigm into practice. And I can point you to Ipoh in Malaysia, or Nanaimo in Canada, or Glasgow, or Barcelona, or Amsterdam, or Grenoble. These are really powerful examples. When crises come, that will be available to turn to. So my answer is, I don't know where the funding comes from, but I know that the inspiration, and that pure inspiration, right? The most inspiring thing is somebody like yourself, who's already doing something that you thought was impossible, but there they are doing it. And we've seen that have real ripple effects. So now Ipoh in Malaysia, a brilliant change maker called Jamila Mahmood has taken it there. And now that it's in Ipoh, it's starting to spread as, what's this like Malaysian version of Doughnut economics look like? They're adapting it to the local culture. It will spread there. So in the absence of the funding that gives you that power, we are building practice, have these ideas up and running, so that when the crises keep coming, as they're going to, here is another way. This is another economy that's possible. It's already in practice. And here are local policymakers who are figuring out the tools, how to spend money differently, how to make decisions differently, how to strategize differently, how to meet differently. In fact, my colleague did a survey of the places that are doing it, and they said the biggest benefit we get is that we're thinking systemically. We're coming together across our local government, meeting, because we're tackling complex issues. There's no way we could do it with the old siloed way. And the Doughnut economics framework invites us to look at everything together. So our strategy is, in the absence of the funding that it would take, have these ideas up and running. They will go from the politically impossible, I believe, to the politically inevitable. And we want to be ready to catch that as it comes.
Thank you. So on health, I think we could probably all talk about health because it's so central to just literally well-being and why it makes sense to be alive. And it's not just health in terms of health care and the health industry, but health in that kind of broader well-being sense. But we know we don't value health. What some have started to realize with climate, again, I mentioned before that the cost of inaction is so much greater than the cost of action, and that's why we should act now with urgency. We've known that for such a long time with health. Of course, it even costs less actually to invest in someone's health than the consequences of not doing that, and yet we don't. And I often, say that because we should also hold those accountable. It's not just more research, more econometrics, more studies, more commissions. Why is it that we choose to act, again, defense, on some areas and choose not to act on others? And I think that's just always really important, especially after having gone through, again, COVID, where we talked about the essential workers and then forgot to call them and treat them and pay them as essential afterwards. Just look at all the strikes that continued. The other thing is kind of the social and economic determinants of health. I also use that word because Michael Marmot, who kind of coined it, is actually a professor here at UCL. It's so important, like when we say missions should be cross-departmental, it's also because the problems literally, that is why we say it should be cross-departmental. I gave the example of climate requiring transport, nutrition, food, clothes, material, cement and steel to change. Health really, if we care about health, it can't just be left to the health ministries. That's also why one of the results that came out of the G20 that happened during COVID, for a little time, there was an agreement that every year health ministers and finance ministers would actually meet precisely to stop that dichotomy of the what's to be done and how to finance it, but that's not happening. But the more interesting thing is at the level of local communities, for example, there was that, where this evidence is that health goes across these different areas, where that police officer, I can't remember her name, she was the chief police officer in Glasgow, who was, bringing her empathetic heart and brain to the problem of knife crime, where she realized, we can't just, it's kind of obvious, but she did it, put those who are committing crimes into jail. We have to better understand why they're doing it, how they feel about themselves. And she literally would bring some of those who were committing crimes to the dentist. It's like, well, you're not going to actually find a job. You're not going to reintegrate into society if we don't take care of you and your own self-worth. And by the way, that's something that Mia Motley, again, in the work that we did, she said that when she goes into schools and students look at her and say, hello, Prime Minister, she says, look at me, you have value. And part of the work they've done there with the missions is both to have a mission itself about dignity, self-worth, and she calls it the culture mission, as well as bringing those issues of dignity, self-worth, and valuing across all missions, kind of as a guiding principle. And lastly, the work, again, that we've done in Brazil, for example, or learning from Brazil, I should say, because we learn more than we do when we work with governments at these different levels. They did something really radical around health. They said, instead of thinking of the usual thing, where you have the innovation state here and biotech, pharma, and then here we have care, the welfare state. How do you bring them together? How do we actually think of the funding, but then who has access to those products? Your question was about products, access, together in the same kind of agency. Again, what we do in the military. The military doesn't just fund health, they care about negotiating with the pharmaceutical companies because the soldiers on the battlefield, if they get sick, they need to get well right away. So access and funding, surprise, surprise, for wartime health funding happens. It doesn't happen with the Department of Health. So in the US, for example, the NIH funds $40 billion a year in health solutions, but then the citizens actually don't have access to it because they haven't thought about access with that health funding. And they brought these two things together, and they call it the health economy industrial complex. So putting in an industrial strategy, not just the innovation funding around health solutions, but really thinking about the welfare state side of things in terms of access, participation, but especially literally making sure that the citizens have access in terms of how those contracts are structured. So 3 more questions. I have one in the middle here in the red shirt, the woman there in the back in the crossy shirt, what do you call it, plaid? And the other woman in the back there in black. Sorry, this is always terrible to randomly choose people. I don't know any of them, so it's not favoritism.
Hi, my name's Sagar. My interest for the last 10 years has been, I thought it was about fashion or building materials, but then I realized it's something much bigger than that, which is the bigger system. And then
Sorry, the big?
The bigger system, the whole system. Mm-hmm. And then I'm looking at materials. Okay, well, none of these materials are coming from Europe or the UK. So I follow the supply chain because that's my interest. And I end up somewhere in Africa or India. And wherever I see these supply chains, the minerals, I'm seeing huge amounts of abuses, not just environmental abuses or deforestation. Mm-hmm. I'm seeing, it's not a surprise to the people in the global south, but I see a lot of child trafficking, I see a lot of sex trafficking, and I see a lot of abuse of the system from the global north. Now here's my question, which is, these products I'm talking about, for which I've followed the supply chain, and for which we are losing forests at a huge rate, deforestation, land being grabbed, everything. Every single one of the minerals that we are being forced to mine and extract and deforest and all the nasty stuff and people displaced, everything else, I follow that supply chain back to home. Where's these minerals going? Every single
Sorry,
one
can
of
you just come to the end?
Yeah,
Because we have lots of,
every single one of these minerals that we are digging up in the global south are 110% relevant for the net zero Green New Deal. So my question is, to the millions of African children that are enslaved in dirty supply chains in Congo, mining that lithium so we can have a green transition here, where is the accountability going to be held unequivocally? Where is Africa going to be introduced to the UN Security Council to actually say, you wanted sustainability, but the only thing you give us in return is more green colonialism? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Woman with glasses and a plaid shirt.
Hiya. Oh, Christ. My name's Ellie Higson, and I work for London and Partners, the growth agency for London. I have kind of stumbled in here as a +1. So I just want to say I'm not necessarily here in a work capacity. But I'm very curious if you could talk more to what the concern is with growth being the mission, if the mission is underpinned by and fueled by principles such as inclusion and sustainability. So sort of what's the benefit of doing it the other way around, and what's the benefit of growth being primary?
Fantastic, thank you. And then I remembered someone was wearing black. There you are.
Hi, I'm Kaya. I work as an economist in central government, and I often find it quite frustrating, the persistence of outdated economic thinking. I was wondering if you have any advice for someone working in a system that often feels overwhelmingly large and rigid. Thank you.
Fantastic. I think we can, so should we start with Jenny on the critical minerals and, yep, and Africa and
Yeah,
exploitation?
I mean, it's not just Africa. It's Latin America, it's parts of Asia, and it's, we need to be, we need the critical minerals. There's no net zero without mining, and we can be, we just have to confront that. But there are so many, there are discussions around mining standards at the moment, which are really important. And the UK, because we've got expertise in mining, we've got the metal exchange, we have universities it's a big part of our heritage. I'm from the northeast of England, family members, thankfully no longer doing mining. But actually, if you go to Chile, just outside Santiago, there is a mine that is completely remotely operated. And I went to meet the miners there. They were wearing shorts, T-shirts, standing behind consoles, operating this mining gear, extracting what they needed to extract. Now the norm should look more like that than it does in far too many places. And the irresponsibility, yes, it's workers and their rights, but it's also like copper tailings and what happens to them, the impact on the environment and the local community, how mine operators work with the local villages, indigenous communities in Latin America have had, very, very bad experiences too often. But we're going to have to make sure, because we need to do the mining, the option of, well, let's not allow extractive industries to operate in these places won't work, because we need those minerals, but also it ought to be. And when I talk to the government of Chile about this, they see this as an opportunity. They don't just want to sell their raw minerals onto global markets. They want to take more of the value out of that supply chain for themselves. And the UK needs to be a partner that wants that too, because a partner that's doing well in Latin America and is getting a good support for its economy through its own resources is a much, much better partner for us in the long run too. So we need to think far longer term than we do at the moment. So some of this is going to be about regulation. Some of it is also going to have to be about strengthening governments where they are allowing this to happen in their country because they don't have labour laws, they don't have trade unionism, they don't have environmental protections, they don't have human rights defenders, they don't have the rule of law, and there's too many things that need to be strengthened and fixed. But when we're talking about partnership, that's the kind of stuff we've got to get into. So this really isn't just about aid programs. This has to be about getting our HMRC, our Met Office, our land registry, even vehicle registration, getting them this access to satellite imagery that they need in order to do the enforcement where deforestation can be seen because there's illegal logging, because there are gangs operating in the forest somewhere. They know they're there, but they can't find them. So there are many sort of technical assistance pieces of work that we can do that would have a very real impact on that. And I think the UK is quite well placed to do that, but to do that in partnership with those countries. And I think I feel quite sort of determined that we do a better job for this, because we've got to do it for those people, but we also need to do it for our ambitions on climate as well.
I think your answer actually also addresses in some ways the second question. And if I can take this one and you take the third one, because I think the third one is more, but there's someone in the audience actually from the Chilean government, Giorgio Jackson, and I think Chile is a really good example for the reasons you said, but that was designed in, right? So if the goal is sustainability, what does it mean for how you extract lithium? If the goal is inclusion, what does it mean for how you produce something, right? So the water, again, report that we looked at, not only the cooling of the data centers uses huge amounts of water, but literally the water use and extraction when lithium or many of these critical minerals are extracted is huge. So how do we look at the SDGs, again, as a dashboard, so you don't solve one, SDG 13 with climate through electrification and cause huge problems on SDG 6 on water. So it's only by having a systems approach, but not blathily on these big kind of goals, but literally creating those dashboards that measure and have systems analysis But unless you have the goals to begin with, there's no reason actually to create conditions on using less water for lithium, on treating workers better, on the chips thing. And so the answer is, you can talk about growth, and you're absolutely right. Like, that's the rhetoric, and that's fine. We all need rhetoric, and the politics of it is really important. But then it's the how that matters. So if growth is the mission, you won't even get to these questions of what does it mean for how we actually extract lithium in a way that's less exploitative of both people and water. But should we go to you for the third one?
Can I pick up on
Sure,
this as well? Though?
Absolutely.
On this point about the connection with the global supply chains, I'm going to switch. So I completely agree with you who asked the question. Decarbonisation leads to rematerialisation. We have to recognise that. And so all the issues you raise are critical. I'm going to bring this to local government. When we work with Amsterdam, as I said at the beginning, we'd say, how can people here live well while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? And the framework brings local government to think beyond the boundaries of the city for the first time. And indeed, we need to think like this beyond the boundaries of the nation. So working with Amsterdam, we were showing how they were globally connected and having impacts on people worldwide. And we put in a statistic saying, well, Amsterdam is the port that's bringing in cocoa from West Africa, and the cocoa plantations as modern-day slavery. And we put this in Amsterdam's Doughnut portrait. And the word came back from the local government that we love the portrait, but take that out. No. We don't like that. We don't think of ourselves like that. That's not nice. That's not, No, it'll never get passed. And we had to go back and say, hang on, you've already got used to the fact that you have this global carbon footprint, right? We've got used to that. This is the social corollary of that. Amsterdam is benefiting from importing cocoa that's coming from plantations with modern-day slavery. Yeah. It's a fact. And to her great credit, the minister, the deputy mayor for sustainability, she pivoted 180 degrees. She then went out to the press and actually said, this is part of our portrait. This is part of who we are. And when we're talking about circularity in Amsterdam, we also have to talk about these social issues. So for me, it's absolutely bringing the issues that you're saying, the responsibility of good lives here, what are the impacts on people worldwide? But I have to say, this is probably where my fellow panelists and I depart, because I think this really connects to the growth question. And I think when we have economies that only can succeed if they continue to grow, it means that the scale of materialization, the scale of everybody in an electric car, I think there's a much bigger onus on us to reduce our demand, because I have not yet seen any country that's decarbonizing at the rate required to continue growing, let alone dematerializing, right? We're decarbonizing, the decoupling's happening. There's no decoupling happening on dematerialization. So we have to transform the way we think is a good life here. We have to move away from owning everyone an electric car to public transit, right? And different kinds of transport. So for me, these are very closely tied together.
Why wouldn't investing in sustainable mobility?
Yes, it would. It could be. But you have to have that vision of reducing our overall demand. For me, I don't believe that we're going to be able to do this with a growth-centric economy, because I haven't seen any evidence that we are decoupling materials from GDP.
Did you want to say something quickly, very, very quickly, to the third question about local?
I heard the third question. I work in government and I'm stuck in really rigid organizations. What can I do? I don't know if I'm the person to answer that.
Yeah,
That's what you said, right?
Okay.
Feeling the pain. Government involves a lot of people, massive bureaucracy, and it's really, really difficult. But I mean, for a bit of hope, I met with the Gates Foundation last night, and one of the things, yes, we know what they've done on malaria and vaccination. It is stunningly good work, and all credit. But actually, what the conversation was about was you have country, and I take what you say about materialisation, but some of the places that I work, they wish, they bet that they don't have vehicles at all. They are using still animals for agriculture, and they have barely register on any sort of measure of carbon emissions. And they need to have some growth to be stable and to be able to support themselves and make their own choices. But the reason for hope in terms of government for some of these places is they don't have this huge bureaucracy and thousands of people working in them, emailing each other all the time. They are now, the Gates Foundation were talking about how we can use technology to allow them to build their state structures and their ways of working that are much more efficient, that use technology far better than we do, even though we've been at this for quite a long time trying to incorporate tech into what we do. It's sort of a mixed success exercise. But when you're starting to form an agency of government from scratch, then you've got an opportunity to go straight to digital and to do things far differently. And I think that's really quite exciting. And this is where the reciprocal learning comes in. And it's not us bequeathing our expertise upon the world. Actually, we're going to be hopefully learning something back about how you build elements of the state far, far more leanly using technology, which is much better for access for our citizens as well.
Can I just add a rejoinder? Because I'd hate to be misunderstood. I absolutely agree. Chad, Malawi, low-income countries around the world, that is exactly where economic growth should be happening, so that those countries can meet the needs of their people. And if they can do that in a way that doesn't overshoot planetary boundaries, like all high-income countries have done, that will be the celebration. That's why I believe countries like ours, which are among the richest countries in the world, should not be going for more growth because we haven't figured out how to decarbonize it sufficiently, let alone dematerialize it. The growth should be happening in other parts of the world.
We would need another hour to debate this, because actually I don't think we're disagreeing. The point is, in the global north, where there's huge amounts of inequality, who is actually setting an agenda? Is it just more and more and more? Or, coming back to some of the questions, how we actually both imagine a different economy, but then structure all the different contracts to be focused on different ways of producing, different ways of distributing, different ways of collaborating, right? So again, sustainable mobility, is it just this thing? Or do we actually use sustainability across all the different areas? Like I'm looking at Dan Hill here, who actually did a lot of work in Sweden on that, to also bring in the kind of contracts that we just talked about before that can also decrease inequality, decrease decarbonization at the same time. But you talk about experimentation, it's only by actually looking where it was achieved instead of just the rhetoric. But if we don't talk about new types of growth, new foundations of growth, we're not going to bring those people in the global north who have not been benefiting by the current structure of global capitalism along the way. And that's when precisely you get back to this dichotomy between, is it growth or is it, climate? So we're actually trying, sorry, Kate, but to debunk some of the myths that I think still underlie a lot of the degrowth movement, which then just leads to a lot of, quickies like this.
We need another hour.
Yeah, but anyway, can I just say thank you so much, especially because it is, again, extremely hot. We're about to all go out and have a drink in the corridor. But thank you so much to the panelists. I don't know if you want to have the last say, Minister Chapman, Jenny.
Yeah, I think I want to talk about this growth thing a little bit more because I realise that I don't really know what we're talking about when we say, for me, we're talking about economic development, which might sound that's a bit old school. But I think it's about giving people the opportunity to move on with their lives, to make decisions. I would love a bit more investment into the northeast of England. And if I need to say to Rachel Reeves, this is a growth thing, in order to get it, then that is what we have to do. That's the currency where we are at the moment. But that doesn't mean it's mindless growth for the sake of it, chasing GDP, and never mind the consequences for people or for the climate or for the planet. That is not at all this government's mission. And I just think that sometimes these terms have just become sort of cheap. Really in our
recycle, repurpose, reuse requires investment. Investment leads to growth. So it depends what kind of growth we're actually going for. But anyway, okay, we can all go out for a drink. Thank you.